Okay, so Al and I are going to be walking you through budgeting in Excel, what an organization should be considering when creating and using a budget. First, I'll walk you through some of the inputs and budgeting factors, and then Al is actually going to demonstrate how to use Excel as a tool to develop a budget that can be updated for various scenarios. So we'll go ahead and get started. So budget planning and monitoring. So what is budgeting? It's all about looking ahead into the future. So the first thing you want to think about are what are your priorities and goals? What would you like to see your organization accomplish, both programmatically and fiscally? There should be ongoing discussions happening throughout the year about what direction the organization is headed in. Typically, organizations will begin budgeting for the following fiscal year several months before year end. This allows ample time for review and revision and gets everyone thinking about the year ahead early on. Budgeting is typically done on an annual basis, but for some organizations, it might make sense to think about the year in smaller periods and create quarterly or monthly budgets. This would be especially if you have cyclical revenue or if there's like one main event that drives your revenue, you may want to break things out into smaller periods. If your revenue is sort of evenly distributed throughout the year, that might not be important or might not make sense to do things in smaller segments. But looking at things in those smaller segments does allow everyone to stay on target throughout the year. It's also important to include programmatic staff and fiscal staff in the budgeting process. We tend to see that programmatic staff spend a little more liberally and they don't necessarily realize the full expanse of expenses that an organization has, all the things, the administrative costs and everything. Whereas on the flip side, the fiscal staff don't really realize the importance of certain spending and how that really helps generate revenue. So I think open communication between the two sides is really important to get everyone aligned and create a realistic budget, It's also beneficial to create departmental budgets. So different departments might have different needs and it might make sense to break down those departments and have individual budgets for each. That'll really help the organization focus their spending. So management should also use the budget as a tool, but understand that it's not set in stone. It can be flexible. It might need to be modified throughout the year. So you can't necessarily hold everyone to this budget. It's important to think about the future and create your budget, but it's also important to recognize events that are happening that might require some changes to that budget. So in the simplest terms, a budget is really made up of two factors, revenue and expense. So the first thing we're going to go over is the revenue and the different revenue streams. You want to think about what your expected revenue would be. So for nonprofits, there are several revenue streams that one or more of these might apply to you. So the first is contributions. If your organization is dependent on contributions, I want you to think about your donor base. Do you have a core group of donors that you can depend on each year for recurring contributions? Or are you the type of organizations that receive significant multi-year pledges where you're getting a lot of revenue up front? You're recording that revenue up front, but then you're not receiving it until later years. Do you receive donations or grants that are for specific purposes? If you're receiving a lot of restricted funds, that's going to impact your budget because you can only use those funds for what their intended purpose was. And that's a good example of somewhere it might make sense for you to have different budgets for different departments or different programs. If you're receiving a lot of funds that are restricted to certain programs, that'll help you budget accordingly. So if your revenue is based on an enrollment, similar concept, is there a steady enrollment? Do you assume a 90% enrollment rate based on historical patterns? And that could be the baseline for your revenue. If you're receiving government grants, are those grants deficit funded? If so, you're required to spend those funds before you can actually recognize the revenue, but you also know exactly how much you're entitled to. So it's a finite level of revenue. Whereas with enrollment or some of the other contribution revenue, you could potentially increase your revenue. And similar to enrollment with the fee-for-service revenue, is there an expected level of units that you're going to be billing for that would be your base level of units to come up with an expected revenue? So those types of things should typically, you would use the prior year as your starting point and kind of predict any changes, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So expected fluctuations in revenue. If you have a rate-based program, whether that's a school or a fee-for-service type program, are there going to be any changes in your rates? So for certain organizations, if you're government funded, the government is establishing your rate, or it's based on the costs that you incurred in the previous year, but you don't actually have control over what your rate is. So are there any planned changes to those government rates? If you are establishing your own rates, it's a private school tuition, for example, and you're establishing those rates yourself, or summer camp, are you planning to increase those rates? So right off the bat, you know what your change in your rate might be because you're increasing it a certain percentage or certain dollar amount. So that's the first thing you want to think about with your expected fluctuations. Next would be contracts. If you are a contract-based organization, do you have any new contracts that you're expecting? Are there any contracts expiring and now you have to make up for that shortfall? So you just want to think ahead. Are those contracts coming due next year? Is it going to be the year after? Do you have plans in place to replace those contracts? Are there new contracts you're trying to get that you're expected to win? So you want to think about that. With a restricted fund release schedule, so do you have a lot of multi-year pledges that are going to be released from restriction this year or in future years? So you want to think about those pledges or other restricted funds that are going to be coming due that are going to be available for you to use this year. Enrollment expectations. So again, we kind of talked about this before, but are you expecting an increase in enrollment or a decrease for some reason? So a lot of organizations, camps, schools, things like that, saw huge dips in enrollment because of COVID. Even if they were able to be open, they saw huge dips because so many people are working from home now. A lot of people were out of work. They didn't need those same childcare facilities. So now that things are kind of reopening, you would expect to see enrollment increase. You want to factor that into your budget so you can be best prepared for it. And lastly, I have on here fundraising plans. Are there any significant fundraising campaigns that are expected to take place? Do you have any fundraising events? So some organizations may hold a large event or conference every 3 years, or an anniversary event every 5 years. So if that event is going to be held in the upcoming year, you want to plan accordingly. Obviously, your revenue would increase, your expenses would increase. Whereas if it's an off year, maybe you would scale back on those things. So those are the different factors to consider when thinking about revenue and your budget. If there's any questions on revenue, you guys can go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I can try to answer them. And if not, we'll just kind of move forward with the expenses. So once you've determined your key revenue streams and how they are going to change in the upcoming year, or what type of expected changes you have, you want to focus on your expenses. So the expenses can really be broken down into two categories: fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs do not change directly based on the amount of revenue earned or the level of services provided. These costs would include management and administrative salaries, occupancy costs such as rent, real estate taxes, utilities, insurance expenses such as property, liability, and D&O insurance. So those are costs that are going to be the same no matter what, basically. They're kind of costs that you're locked into for the year. Variable costs fluctuate directly with the amount of revenue earned or level of service provided. Some examples would be program staff salaries, program supplies, meals, and transportation. So in addition to thinking of costs on those, let's see, we have a question. So there was a question about like-minded organizations working together on fundraising versus competing. I think that there is some benefit there. I've seen some other organizations sort of collaborate to host an event, and they both work together, and then they have a profit sharing agreement basically. So I think that there is some benefit there, and it does work for some organizations. I think you need to think about your organization, what your goals are, but I certainly could see the benefit to it. So there's another category about question about income, expenses, and revenue, or really the net income, your income less your expenses. So that would be kind of the outcome of your budget, would be your income or revenue, your expenses, and then what you're left over with, which would be the outcome that we'll talk about later on too. So with the inputs, so we kind of went over fixed costs and variable costs. Let's talk about cost allocations a little bit. As nonprofits, you're all required to break your expenses down, not just between the natural classifications of salaries, fringes, professional fees, etc., the line items that you would see on your statement of functional expenses. You also need to break it down between functional categories. So program, fundraising, and management in general. So for example, employees that work in multiple functions, their salary should be allocated to the salary line item on your financial statements, but then also between program, fundraising, and management in general, based on how they spend their time. So some other costs that are generally allocated would be fringe benefits. We would expect to see that allocated between the categories based on the salary allocation. Occupancy costs could be allocated based on square footage. So when you're allocating costs and thinking about what is a program service cost versus what is a fundraising cost or what is a management cost, you want to think of program service costs as being those costs that directly further your mission. They should be directly related to that. Whereas fundraising costs would be about generating fundraising revenue for the organization, and management in general would be sort of the administrative costs and the overhead that all organizations have. So it's also important, especially in today's day and age, to be cognizant of the level of program service spending versus spending on those other supporting services, fundraising and management in general. Not only for compliance, if you receive government grants or other government funding, there could be caps on the level of administrative expenses that you're allowed to have, a 10 or a 15% cap on overhead, which would mean that 85 to 90% needs to be spent on program services. But also, if you're just an organization that receives contributions and you don't really have those government regulations, many donors are now taking to websites like GuideStar or Charity Navigator to research organizations prior to donating. They want to see how their funds are being spent. They're getting very savvy with this. So it's definitely something you want to consider. You see all the time news articles come out about organizations and their CEO salaries and how much is being spent on overhead versus other organizations advertising that 90 cents of every dollar goes towards the mission. What they're saying there is that they have a program service percentage of 90% and their overhead is only 10%. So that's really how that translates into your fundraising campaigns, and the way you're going to advertise your organization as being efficient, and really everyone wants to feel good about where they're donating their money to and that it's going to go directly to the cause that they intended to. No one wants to be, padding another executive's pocket. So I think it's important to think about those cost allocations and what they really mean in the scheme of things. And what we would recommend is developing a formal written cost allocation policy that you can use during the year and refer back to figure out how to allocate costs. So that should include how you're allocating salaries, whether that be with time studies or other estimates, how you're allocating your space and utilities, is that based on square footage, and other even breaking it down further, how are you allocating between multiple programs if that applies to your organization as well? So just because someone is a program staff, how are you allocating their costs across different programs? So I see a question about using budget to build reserves, and we will kind of touch on that later on too. So if we get to the end and you still have questions about it, I'll elaborate on it. The next step to think about, or something I wanted to bring up, is budget versus cash flow. So when you're doing budgets, what your revenue and expense may be on your GAAP basis financial statement isn't necessarily the funds that are available to you to spend. So one of the things to think about is payments towards outstanding debt that you may have. If you have a mortgage, or if you have a line of credit, or any other types of loans, and you're making payments on that debt throughout the year, those aren't going to be recorded in your expenses. So it's not necessarily going to be picked up on your budget in that sense, but it's an outlay of cash that has to happen. Conversely, non-cash expenses like depreciation and amortization expense, they're recorded on the books, they're considered part of your expenses, but there's no cash outlay. So those funds are still available to you to use for other purposes. So you just want to think about those things as you're creating the budget. Are you creating your budget based on a GAAP basis, a generally accepted accounting principles, and the way to match your financial statements? Or are you thinking of it more on a cash basis and the cash inflows and cash outflows that will be occurring? And then similarly to revenue, you want to think about what's going to be changing. So what are the expected fluctuations in expenses? You want to think about these particularly as it relates to the changes that you may be seeing in your revenue and how those may impact your variable costs. And it won't necessarily, so like as we talked about, your fixed costs are going to pretty much remain the same, but your variable costs are going to be changing. So you want to think about what changes did we predict for our revenue streams, and then how will that now affect our expenses? So will we need to hire additional staff to meet our service needs? Are costs rising each year despite similar operations? So health insurance is a fringe benefit that we see increase across the board pretty much every single year, even if you have the same number of staff. So you want to think ahead. Even if things are remaining the same, are there going to be some costs that are going to increase regardless? Are there any governmental budget cuts that are expected, and would they cause the organization to lose a program? So kind of how we talk about losing a contract, a government contract, and how that would impact your revenue. It will also impact your expenses. Or are there any other budget cuts happening? Are there any rate changes happening? Are there any plans to make major capital improvements? So if you're planning to purchase a building or any other type of major asset, that's great. That's great for your organization. And now you're going to be putting an asset on the books, but it's also going to require a cash outlay, and it's going to impact your cash flow needs. So you want to think about that. So when you're working on your budget, you want to come up with a few different scenarios. So a conservative approach could mean assuming everything is remaining consistent with the prior year and the organization is not going to be growing at all. You're just keeping everything the same. It should include any potential funding cuts or decreases in revenue, because again, you want to be conservative here. A realistic approach should consider prior year operations and those baseline levels of revenue and expenses that we discussed, and any changes that are more likely than not to occur. So anything that you're really expecting should be included in your realistic budget. An expected growth budget should be based on the direction the organization is headed in, and consider growth levels in previous years and what that might mean for your future. So if your organization is still young and in the growing phase and it's growing rapidly, you might see a 50% increase over the prior year, and that could be realistic or expected for you. And then just like you plan for the worst case scenarios, you also want to think about the best case scenarios. So if you have an outstanding year and find yourself with a surplus, is there a plan for those excess funds? So although a conservative approach would be leaving those surplus funds in a bank account it might not always be the best approach. So it's a good idea to have a discussion between management and the board or your governing body about what will be done with surplus funds. Maybe they should be invested, in which case an investment policy should be established, or maybe the board wants to create a board designated fund to be used in the future. And those are things you want to think about too. So you want to think about, if we have a really good year and we end up with extra money, what's our plan for that? We did see certain clients this year, despite being COVID, they kind of had a shift in their operations and they had an outstanding year, and they ended the year with a lot more money than they expected just based on the industry that they were in. And they had to think about, what are we going to do with this money in the future now? And leaving it in a bank account where it's not really earning any interest might not be the best solution. You might be better off actually investing it even in low risk investments where you're getting a higher yield. So the next step would be to evaluate the outcomes of each scenario and adjust accordingly. So you want to consider the following. You want to consider your growth goals. Are you meeting your expected growth goals based on the budget that you've established? If you have any debt covenants, are you meeting those covenants, or are you exposing the organization to increased risk? If you're not meeting those covenants, what needs to change to be in compliance? If you're receiving deficit funding, looking at your spending on a contract by contract basis, is there overspending or underspending occurring? If so, see how costs may need to be shifted around. Or if you find yourself with a surplus in your budget, it might be a good time to think about some major projects. So to answer the question about budgeting to build reserves, when you're looking at the outcome of your budget, if your goal is to build reserves, you want to look at your revenue, you want to look at your expenses, look at your net income, and see how can we cut expenses potentially, or how can we increase revenue to help build those reserves to be used for the future. So are there any questions on what we've gone over so far that I haven't addressed before I pass it over to Al to kind of give you a little background info and then really give you a visual representation of an Excel budget? Okay, Al, I'll pass it off to you.
Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to go over a practical example kind of a budget that we've utilized as far as building a dynamic budget within Excel. I think to reiterate the point of preparing a dynamic budget has become increasingly important, especially how quickly the world has changed. I think COVID really had, the pandemic and everything else has pivoted the operations of a lot of the nonprofits and has had you guys to think quicker, faster, and to get that information at a quicker time, to even adjust your budgets. Also, a lot of times is now during the pandemic, you've had to get the information a lot of times quicker to your board or your finance committee, to actually discuss the real impact of what's going on. All of a sudden, when the pandemic hit back in March, you were in a situation where next month your operations could have dramatically changed, as well as your enrollment levels or everything else, depending on which particular niche you guys are in within your nonprofit. So creating a dynamic budget that is useful and you have the ability to analyze changes and inputs on the fly, the ability to create a budget in Excel that is user friendly, where you could pass it on to your finance committee and be able to change the inputs real quick and see what the overall bottom line is. If there are expected cuts or expected from the state, if there are expected cuts, how are those cuts going to affect my bottom line? I think within the education industry, there were talks of 20% budget cuts. There were talks of all of this, and it happening very quickly. And for you guys to have to recreate a budget on the fly, basically, and that's kind of what we want to talk about here. And what I'm going to bring you through is a practical example of creating an idea of creating a budget within Excel that you could have all these inputs and be able to really analyze things on the fly. Now, there's a couple of different things and utilizations of tools that we could use within budget. And there's a couple of tips and tricks that I'll go over today. I'm not going to go into in depth with how to utilize these formulas, because what could happen is I could speak all day about Excel formulas and teach you how to do this, but I'm going to take you more through the top level of how this is all going to work. My first tip for you guys would be create lists. As Mahnaz was discussing earlier, you really need to be able to define the inputs and your drivers of your business, both revenues and expenses. So if I'm able to really define what inputs do I have, have I experienced a 2% growth, a 5% growth year over year? Has the state or whatever my funding source be, have they been experiencing increases, and is that predictable year over year? And you want to be able to create your list based off of basically those inputs that you've defined, both for revenues and expenses. The next thing is creating matrices that basically lay out the way that your inputs interplay with each other. So if I have a 2% increase, let's say, or a 5% increase or 10% increase in certain areas of my budget, how does that interplay with everything else that I'm doing? Mostly you're going to see this on the expense side of things, where if I have a 10% decrease in salaries because I got to make budget cuts, that's going to affect my fringe benefits. That's going to affect maybe my payroll processing cost. Also, it's going to affect if I have a retirement plan or insurance plan that I provide my employees. All of that interplays with each other. And you start to really get a feel for how your budgets kind of interact with one another. I think sometimes we've stepped into clients that have been a little bit more traditional in their approach to budgeting and not necessarily have been able to create such a dynamic budget in order to be able to analyze things on such a fly. And I think, like I said before earlier, the pandemic really has kind of shifted everyone in this direction of, I really need to be able to analyze things pretty quickly. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to Excel, so that way I could kind of show you an example of a budget that we created for a school. So what we did was we created the list in Excel of what we're going to do. So we wanted to define when we had discussions, and remember, the whole purpose of a budget is not only to be able to analyze and budget what your year is going to be, but it's also so that way your finance committee and everyone else is able to really analyze, if I have a budget cut, how does that impact my operations going forward? And these should be meaningful discussions on an ongoing basis with your finance committee. Also, as Mahnaz was mentioning before, even with your programmatic individuals, where you're creating those separate programmatic budgets for each one of your departments, all of this becomes very important, because it could be very top level and it could be very micro level as well on each one of your individual programs that you guys run. So a lot of discussion needs to happen here throughout the year. So what we did was, for this particular example, what we created was a drop down for budget cuts within the state, because there were education budget cuts being discussed, staff increases. So what if they decided to keep it flat? We need to try to keep our employees happy. So maybe we want to try to give them a little bit of boost. So if we want to give them a boost, how does that interplay if we have a surplus? If we end up having budget cuts within the state that is going to eventually flow down to our tuition rates and hit us now, maybe I have to make some staff cuts. So what we did was, and I'll take you through that, we actually had the client go through and literally rate all of their staff on a 1 to 4 level here, that if they had a 5% decrease in their budget and had a budget cut, well, maybe that means that I have to cut out everyone that I rated a level 1 cut. The other thing was operating costs. Maybe there are some operating costs that I want to decrease 5%. So these are just some basic generic lists that we created for this client And the reason why we did that is because within Excel, you could actually create down menus, which we did here. And let me just zoom in a little bit, make this easier on everyone. So what we did was we created this kind of summary input page for any of the users of the budget. So what we did was we created what we thought were going to be our enrollments within each given grade. This particular client does a high school 9th through 12th grade. This is where our list actually come into play. So as we were talking about earlier, what you want to do is you want to create a multiple scenario model. You don't want to just have it stagnant in one area. You want to have your worst case scenario, your best case scenario, and then kind of a more realistic scenario, and be able to interchange and play those. So that way you could, if all of a sudden something like COVID hits or something else in the world changes, because as Ken was speaking to in his early morning address to everyone in the opening speech, the world's changing quickly and more rapidly than I think sometimes people could keep up with. And you need to be able to change on the fly. I think that's going to be my whole mantra and my whole, big point throughout this, throughout my piece of presentation is you need to be able to change this dynamically, quickly. So what we created also for the finance committee and what we even created for the board is to be able to utilize this budget and not necessarily have to rely on the internal financial staff to say, hey, if we're going to have this 5% budget cut, how does this interplay on our overall big picture? We were actually able to give this as a useful tool to them to basically be able to drop down menus and play with this, and be able to say, all right, if I have a 5% budget cut, as you could see, my summary page actually gives me what my total expenses are, my total revenues, my total expenses, and what my potential surplus or deficit is in that scenario. As you can see here, this is my staffing level cuts. So if I only wanted to do my staffing level cuts at 1, well, with a 5% budget cut, and if I was doing, I don't know why I would do staff increases if I was doing a budget cut, but if I had no staff increases, there was a 5% budget cut. Well, this is going to interplay at me at 15, putting me in a deficit situation. So this is not an optimal scenario for me, and I got to make sure that from a finance perspective that I'm telling my client, well, we got to rethink things. Are we going to be aggressive in our marketing approach? We're trying to get an enrollment. For districts, that's not as easy, but for other schools that we deal with within the private education realm, they could potentially aggressively market and try to get students to actually come into their program. In scenario 2, as you can see, there's no budget cut. They actually had a little bit more enrollment that we were projecting. We wanted to do a 4% increase in the staff. We weren't going to make any cuts, and we weren't going to make any cuts within our operating cost. So now this gives bottom dollar. So when I was talking about the matrices before of kind of how you want to lay this out, and I know this is a lot to digest within Excel. There's a lot going on behind the scenes within it here. But the way to lay it out and always think about it is in a matrix. And the way that we laid this out is, well, in a 95% scenario where we were only going to get 95% revenue, this is kind of the way this is what my revenue lays out by month, by student. And we laid out kind of all the interplays here. Because remember, everything in the operations and the budget all has an interplay as far as with, if I make this move on this side, how is it going to affect my revenues and expenses on the other side? And what we did was here, we laid out the individual budget. So you would do this as you would traditionally normally do in a budgeting, when you're budgeting for the next fiscal year or the remainder of the year. Jennifer, we could definitely simplify this down a little bit, and we could be able to provide this to you as well. Within here, it's a little bit more detailed, but I'll try to create a little bit more of a simplified version that kind of shows you how to do some of this, as well as share some materials with you guys. So within each one of these tabs, you're actually able to see the interplay of the way that the inputs actually affected my overall budget. And what we did for this particular client is we actually broke it out by month, July, August, throughout the year for the school year to really interplay. Now, where this helps out is also with the cash flow piece that Mahnaz was talking about earlier. Within my cash flow piece, when is that going to hit? Am I going to have a surplus? For those of you that might have filed for, let's say, ERTC late, later after it came out, that you guys realized that you guys actually qualified for it. What ended up happening was ERTC, if you file for it late, you may not see that money 6 months from now. It's not going to help you. It will help you later on in the future, but it may not help you now. So one of these cash pieces actually going to hit. This particular client, some of their revenues they get in on a quarterly basis and they get prepaid for it. Some of it they get monthly. Some of it they have to file an expenditure report or a request for drawdown on their funds for the grants that they receive. And all of that is a timing mechanism to make sure and to figure out what your cash flows are. As you guys probably have experienced during the pandemic, not every state agency or your funding source was very responsive when you were giving them a request for drawdown, and some of these payments were delayed. So creating a dynamic budget like this in Excel also gives you the advantage of figuring out what's my timing here. When am I creating those surpluses? And if I am creating a big surplus at the end of the day, let me go back to my inputs and summary screen. In this case scenario, in scenario 2, I do have a surplus, but is that surplus big enough if I want to expand my school a little bit, if I want to expand my operations a little bit? I have some major repairs and maintenance that I need to do on my facility. And you could lay this out to do a cash flow as well, to figure out where you're going to have that cash in order to expend. Some people don't receive some of their funding until the end of the year, and then that's where finally all of a sudden all this cash hits the bank. But sometimes that, for certain of the schools, when enrollment's down during the summertime, well, that needs to help carry me through the summertime. And I think as schools were opening up, and I refer to schools a lot because my particular base is within the school realm, a lot of the clients that I deal with. July and August, their enrollment's down. So they need that surplus to help them carry them through the summer, especially coming out of the pandemic when enrollments and parents not being as receptive to remote services. And I'm sure many of the nonprofits that have joined us today, some of your consumers might have not have been as receptive to receiving services during the COVID pandemic, remotely versus in person, which affected everyone's business. You might have seen a 40% dip in your services just because of the remote versus non-remote. But hopefully as we come out of this, we're creatively thinking our operations of maybe now remote services will help us generate a whole population that we weren't able to reach out to too, because it was a far distance. We didn't want to create a kind of a site far away. So all of this leads down to the financial piece of it, of being able to budget and really take a look at realistic numbers. And that's kind of the whole overall goal of this, is to be able to really look at real numbers and be able to change on the fly, be able to make realistic decisions when you need it, and not say, hey, I need a budget now and it's going to take an entire month to create a budget. You should be able to play with these things within even a useful tool like Excel. Yes, there are other applications out there that will do this for you, but I feel like using Excel and really trying to figure out what your inputs are, and the interplay be all this makes you smarter financially, and makes you a smarter business, and it makes you a smarter nonprofit, really thinking about the interchanges between your operations here. If I have an aggressive marketing campaign, maybe I'll be able to bring in more revenue. Maybe I'll be able to bring in more service. And it gets you to think a little bit more as you start to create such a dynamic budget. I see I only have 4 minutes left, so I'm actually going to leave it open to questions for Mahnaz and I. If you guys have any questions, I know we will share the template. We will coordinate with our marketing team. We may even post it online for you guys. So we will definitely share this with you. I know Excel could be intimidating for some. Some of the formulas could be intimidating. I have, I tend to go a little bit more on the computer programmer background where I'll nest formulas together and create these crazy formulas to do something like this. But at the end of the day, if you take things in bite-sized chunks and really slowly digest the information and using a simple sum formula and then adding that in with some other statement within Excel to help build this, usually always breaking it down into small steps and then building upon it will help snowball the way that you create your budget at the end of the day. What does the process look like for a management team working with a team? What does the process look like for a management team working with a team like yours? I'm assuming you meaning retaining Kate. I'm assuming you're talking about retaining a consultant sort of and working with an outside firm like us. I'm going to take that question kind of in that direction. What it is we'll sit down with any client of ours that would like us to try to create something like this. And what we will do is we'll figure out what your inputs are. We'll talk to you and really kind of put our fingers on the pulse of your operations and say, and digest it line by line on your GL and basically say, all right, well, is this necessary? And we have a meaningful discussion with our clients, and we build a relationship with a lot of our clients to really say, what's the interplay with your operations? Have you ever thought about X? Have you ever thought about Y? Because everything kind of interplays with each other in nonprofit or in business, for that matter. If I make X decision, it's going to have Y impact on my business, and I could be able to quantify that in an Excel, an Excel document to create a budget. I hope that kind of answers your question. I know that one could kind of take all different directions there. Is there a guide that you recommend for Excel formulas? I'll be honest with you. There's a lot of great resources on. There's a lot of great resources on YouTube. Little bites here and there of easily digestible 10, 15-minute videos. Sometimes they're a little bit more specific. So, I always find, there's all sorts of resources out there. But again, those little 10, 15-minute videos that people put on YouTube, those are a great resource.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us this morning and taking part in Al and my session. You can feel free to reach out to us via email. You can find our contact information on the Cerini Associates website. And we look forward to hearing from any of you with questions.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.